She shouldn't be crawling down that ramp anyway. Liability goes both ways.
That's what Lorinda Caskell, president of the Larchwood Glen HOA board, said, as my 79-year-old mother lay screaming on the pavement with her hip twisted beneath her. Odessa Vec, my mother, hadn't even made it 3 feet down the white oak accessibility ramp before Lorinda's arm extended, fingers flat, and pushed her walker just enough to send her off balance. And then Lorinda smirked, not even a wince. The board warned you about the aesthetics, she added, her heels clicking on the concrete as she walked away like nothing had happened. Now, maybe you'll take it seriously. Except I'd already installed a tilt sensor inside the ramp's central beam. It wasn't just ADA compliant. It was calibrated to OSHA thresholds, every footfall, every weight shift, logged, time-stamped. And Lorinda just triggered it. If you're watching this and you've ever seen an HOA target someone vulnerable, someone like your parent or your child, subscribe now. Because I'm about to walk you through how I dismantled Larchwood Glen's entire board, one forensic receipt at a time. My name is Dorian Vec. I spent 18 years investigating catastrophic workplace accidents as a forensic rehab consultant and OSHA auditor. That ramp, I didn't just build it. I drafted the stress map by hand and carved every joint with reclaimed timber from my father's last courthouse project before he died. When I found Mom bleeding on it, I didn't freeze. I went to work. Not because I'm fearless, because that ramp is a promise. And Lorinda spit on it. She'd been circling for weeks, warnings about non-conforming elevation. Letters citing visual disharmony with a colonial trim. She never mentioned safety, never asked about my mom's strokes. Never once acknowledged that my father died on this same property, hands in soil, blueprints on his lap, planning the ramp for her, for Odessa. Lorinda's crusade wasn't about rules. It was about power, and Larchwood Glen gave her a badge. This neighborhood sells itself as serene, multi-generational living. Winding roads, pond out front, and a clubhouse so sterile it looks like a dentist office lobby. But behind the brick entry sign and seasonal flags, there's a board drunk on control. They banned our neighbor's epilepsy alert dog for excessive sniffling. They tried to charge a 93-year-old woman for unauthorized potted plants. I've watched them fine a disabled veteran for parking his truck too close to his own curb. And now, my mother was their latest target. Odessa doesn't fight back. She's Grace in a cardigan. When Dad died, she said, "Let's stay here. He built this for us." She didn't ask me to retire early or move in, but I did. Because every morning she'd wobble to the porch and still say, "I'll be fine." And I'd nod like I believed her. But today, she wasn't fine. Her leg was at an angle no leg should bend. Her voice didn't sound like my mother. And I swear to God, I saw Lorinda look down at her like she was clutter on a sidewalk. I dropped to my knees, checked for head trauma, called 911, logged the timestamp on my sensors app. Then I snapped photos, entry angle, scuff marks, blood pools spread. And while the sirens wailed in the distance, I opened the HOA manual on my phone. I already knew what I'd find. No clause forbids ramps, no bylaw overrides ADA federal statute, no rule justifies shoving an old woman because you don't like the wood stain. But Lorinda didn't care. She never did. Because for the last 8 years, no one had challenged her. That ended today. Odessa was still conscious when the paramedics loaded her into the rig. She reached for my hand and said one word. Why? I didn't have the answer then, but I do now. Because Lorinda Caskell thought no one would stop her. But I stopped refinery explosions with a clipboard and a flashlight. I've reversed million-dollar claims based on the angle of a bruise. And I sure as hell know what a fracture caused by external lateral force looks like. The doctor confirmed it 3 days later. And that report? It wasn't just evidence. It was the match. The bruises on my mother's back were a map, blotches of purple and yellow that told a story Lorinda would swear never happened. The paramedics logged her vitals, stabilized her femur, and rushed her to the trauma ward while I stood outside the ER, fists curled so tight my nails cut into my palms. I wasn't just furious. I was boiling inside with one question. How many others had Lorinda walked away from? It didn't take long to find out. By the time Odessa was in recovery, I was back in Larchwood Glen with a clipboard and a calm face. That's the trick with people like Lorinda. They're used to outrage, not procedure. Outrage gets ignored, But clipboards make people nervous. The community bulletin board was still filled with pastel flyers and spring-themed announcements. Art classes in the clubhouse, garden club meetings, some pool maintenance notice, and nestled between them, the latest HOA violation postings. I recognized 3 names immediately. Residents I'd seen struggle, limp, age. They'd all gotten cited within the past month for things like ramp slope deviation or unapproved structural paint. No one complained out loud, not in front of the board. But when I knocked on doors, things changed. Patrice on Mulberry Lane used a cane. Her front handrail had been flagged for removal. Ronald across the pond had a lift installed for his wife, and Lorinda fined them weekly until he removed it. A Korean War veteran on Cyprus had adapted his mailbox height for easier access, and the HOA forced him to reset it. None of them had cameras, none had official statements, but all of them had one thing in common: shame. They didn't want to make noise. They didn't want to be trouble, so they swallowed it. And that's what Lorinda banked on. She moved through this neighborhood like a school principal on a power trip, enforcing silence with citations and fear. If anyone pushed back, she'd threaten escalating fines, legal letters, or community shaming. The worst part? She had help. A whole board of enablers who nodded along and signed the letters with passive smiles. But they weren't all loyal. Merritt Halden was different. I saw him that afternoon at the community pond, crouched low, tossing breadcrumbs to a turtle that didn't seem interested. His hands trembled more than I remembered, and he didn't look up when I approached. "You saw it, didn't you?" I asked. He blinked hard, shook his head like someone brushing off a fly. "I was inside, didn't see anything." "Except you weren't inside, Merritt. You were trimming the hydrangeas, front yard, north side, same line of sight as my ramp." He didn't deny it. He just said nothing, which said everything. I knew his wife Calla had been denied a patio ramp last fall. Lorinda said it would obstruct the HOA's seasonal landscaping. I also knew Merritt hadn't voted that day. His abstention made the denial possible. That kind of guilt doesn't sit still. He still wouldn't speak, but he didn't walk away either. That was enough, for now. Later, as I was heading back up to my place, I spotted Lorinda standing at the edge of my property again, hands clasped behind her back, inspecting, measuring maybe. Her eyes were locked on the base of the ramp. She didn't say anything this time, just nodded like she'd already made some private decision and walked away. I checked my mailbox a few minutes later and found a new citation. Non-conforming ramp materials, violation code 4.2b. Fines begin in 72 hours. I smiled, because I knew something Lorinda didn't. There was no 4.2b. I'd reviewed the bylaws line by line that morning. Her citation wasn't just petty, it was fabricated. That meant she'd crossed the line from overreach into fraud. Now I had motive, pattern, and soon I'd have proof. The next day I received the preliminary trauma report from the hospital. It wasn't final, but one line stopped me cold. Fracture indicates external lateral force inconsistent with natural fall trajectory. That was it. Not a full smoking gun, but the chamber was warm. I knew I'd need more than bruises and memories to tear this board down. But I also knew where to look next. Not in garages, not in basements, in silence. The silence of people too tired to speak until someone speaks for them. The next morning, fog hung low over Larchwood Glen, softening the rooftops and making every porch look like a stage set, waiting for actors who hadn't shown up yet. I walked toward the clubhouse because I needed answers, official ones, written ones, the kind Lorinda couldn't twist or bury. If she was fabricating violation codes, then the truth wouldn't be in what the HOA posted. It would be in what they hid in plain sight. The clubhouse door was propped open for the weekly property review session, which was really just an excuse for board members to gossip about residents under the banner of community oversight. I stepped in quietly, clipboard in hand, wearing the same neutral face I used during OSHA audits. A smile disarms people. A clipboard disarms liars. Inside, I saw him, Merritt Halden, standing at the far end of the long conference table, shuffling papers he didn't seem to actually read. He looked smaller indoors, like the walls were pressing on him. He wasn't the type who belonged in a room full of people making decisions. He was the type who stayed in the background, offering help only when asked gently. And Lorinda loved people like that, bendable, silent, loyal by fear. He heard me walk in and stiffened immediately. His shoulders locked, his breath caught. He didn't turn around. He just froze, hands gripping the papers so tightly his knuckles went pale. I said nothing. I wanted him to speak first, to reveal where his conscience leaned. Instead, he shuffled the pages once, set them down, and mumbled, "Meeting starts in 20. His voice cracked halfway through the sentence. "It's open session?" I asked. He nodded too quickly. "Public attendance permitted, comments controlled by chair." He swallowed hard. "You know how she is." That was the first honest thing he'd said since Odessa fell. I walked closer, not enough to crowd him, but enough that he couldn't keep pretending I wasn't there. His eyes kept darting to the door like a man checking escape routes. "Merritt," I said quietly, "I'm not here to put you on the spot." He closed his eyes for a moment, just 1 second. But I saw the war inside him. He wasn't just afraid of Lorinda. He was afraid of what speaking up would make him. A traitor to the board, a disruptor. A man who'd finally acted after years of swallowing his own voice. He opened his eyes again, and the guilt hit him so visibly it almost looked like physical pain. "I didn't see anything," he said automatically. But his hands trembled again. "No one asked you what you saw," I replied. His breathing stuttered, a tiny betrayal of his own lie. I let the silence settle. Silence is powerful. People fill it with the truth they're trying to hide. Finally, he whispered, "You know what she'll do to me. If I say something, I shouldn't." I remembered his wife, Kala, her quiet apology when her request for a ramp was denied. The tired way she said, "Don't make trouble, Merritt. They'll make it worse for everyone." He wasn't afraid for himself. He was afraid for her. He pressed his palms against the table. "You weren't supposed to confront me here. Anyone could walk in." I scanned the room. "No one's here, Merritt, not yet. And I'm not asking for a confession." But he heard what I wasn't saying, yet mattered. Lorinda's voice floated down the hallway then, sharp and clipped, carrying that false brightness she used like perfume. Merritt flinched at the sound. Actually flinched. Not fear of Lorinda herself, fear of being caught near me. He straightened abruptly, pulling together a stack of papers with fumbling hands. "I shouldn't be talking to you," he whispered. "Not before the meeting." I lowered my voice to match his. "You weren't talking to me. You were standing near me." I paused. "And trying very hard to convince yourself, you didn't watch someone shove an old woman down a ramp." The air left him in a shaky exhale. That was it. That was the crack in the dam. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He didn't have to. When Lorinda entered, he moved away from me so fast his chair toppled. She shot him a cold look, then glanced at me with that same condescending tilt of her head. "Property review starts at 9 sharp, she said. "Observations are welcome. Interference is not." She walked past me like I was furniture she intended to fine for existing. But Merritt kept his eyes on me for half a second, just long enough to see the promise in my expression. I wasn't going to let this go. Not for Mom, not for Kala, not for anyone she'd silenced. Outside authority wasn't here yet, but the first thread had pulled loose, and Merritt Halden was unraveling. By the time the new citation arrived, Odessa was still in the hospital, and I hadn't slept in 2 nights. The letter was folded twice, slid under my door instead of mailed, and printed in that same passive-aggressive serif font the board always used. "Violation of material compliance," it read. Section 4.3c, ramp materials inconsistent with community standards. Fines begin Friday. There is no 4.3c in the Larchwood Glen bylaws. I checked again just to be sure. Nothing about material consistency. Nothing about the color of ramps or the grain of wood. The original ramp design was submitted, stamped, and approved 2 years ago, long before Lorinda decided that pushing the elderly was part of neighborhood maintenance. I printed a copy of the bylaws, highlighted the non-existent section in red, and stapled it to my front gate with a sticky note that read, "Try again." That same afternoon, the HOA escalated. This time, it wasn't a letter. It was a person. Gerald Linver, vice president of the board and Lorinda's longtime yes man, showed up with a clipboard, a digital measuring tape, and a neon orange sticker in hand. I watched from the window as he stepped up to the ramp like it was a biohazard. He didn't even knock. just crouched low, snapped a photo of the structure's edge, and slapped the sticker across the bottom rail. Unapproved modification, subject to removal. I stepped out the door before he turned around. "You're trespassing," I said, "and defacing medical equipment." He flinched slightly but recovered fast. "This is property. Inspection, board approved, not without notice." "Verbal warning was given last week at the meeting," he said, not even looking me in the eye. "That wasn't a warning. That was Lorinda making a threat." He didn't answer, just turned and walked back down the driveway, logging something on a tablet. I could hear the quiet clicks of checkboxes being tapped, probably marked me as non-compliant. I pulled the sticker off, took a photo of it, then documented the timestamp of Gerald's visit. Everything now had to be logged, every footstep, every quote, every inspection. Because I knew what they were trying to do, they were building a paper wall around me, one violation at a time, until they could justify forced removal. They wanted to crush me under procedure, but they didn't know that procedure was my home turf. My phone buzzed. Hospital update. Mom's fracture was clean but serious. Surgery scheduled. Recovery expected to take weeks. She'd need physical therapy, likely more than one round. I sat down on the bottom step of the ramp and stared at the grain of the wood, the same wood my father and I had sanded together when I was 17. He built courtrooms, jury boxes, witness stands. I built this ramp with the same precision, because he taught me that justice doesn't start in the courtroom. It starts when people feel safe walking into one. And now, my mother couldn't walk at all. I knew the board was watching. I'd seen them before, peeking through curtains, standing a little too long at the edge of the sidewalk, pretending they were checking landscaping when they were just checking who still had the nerve to stand up to them. Let them watch. Because I wasn't just defending a structure, I was defending the right for someone like my mother to step outside her own home without being punished for needing help. And that made this personal. That evening, I reviewed my footage archive again. The smart cam still had the tampered timestamp, a sudden blackout right as Lorinda had approached. I isolated the clip, exported it, and flagged it with a note. Intentional interference suspected. Confirm landscape crew schedule. Then I pulled up the landscaping records on the HOA portal. There it was. Routine trimming, property 12/17, scheduled 8 a.m., completed 8:46 a.m. The outage occurred at 8:31 a.m., exactly 15 minutes after Lorinda's arrival. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was a crack. All I needed was one clean break in their manufactured story, and Merritt Holden still hadn't looked me in the eye since the meeting. He knew something. Lorinda was tightening the screws, the fake citations, the sticker, the visits. It was the pressure campaign they always used: crush, isolate, erase. But this time, she'd picked the wrong structure to dismantle, because I built it, and I don't walk away from structural failures. The trauma report came in the following morning, slid across the hospital counter, in a manila envelope like it was something routine. I recognized the surgeon's name, Dr. Henley, a spinal trauma specialist, with no reason to dramatize a finding. The man had a reputation for clean language and clinical detachment, but his language this time wasn't detached. Fracture and bruising patterns suggests sudden external lateral force, inconsistent with a standard downward fall. Recommend forensic review if mechanism of injury is contested. My breath caught halfway through the second sentence. This wasn't just a broken hip. This wasn't a stumble on uneven planks or a misstep from a weak ankle. The bruising wasn't aligned with forward motion. It was side force, a push. And that kind of evidence, that was admissible. I took the report, signed the copy release, and scanned it to 2 locations: my personal archive and a legal time-stamping service I'd used for years. That was something Lorinda didn't understand. I didn't just document incidents, I certified evidence. By noon, I was on the phone with my old contact from the State Elder Protection Division, laying out the preliminary findings. She couldn't promise action without formal submission, but her voice changed when I said the word physician certified. "We'll flag it," she said. "Send everything in writing." I asked if they accepted third-party affidavits. "If the witness is willing," she said, "but we'll need that statement notarized." My thoughts went immediately to Merritt, but before I could reach him, Lorinda beat me to the next move. A new letter arrived, this one printed on heavier stock paper like a corporate announcement. Notice of safety review, immediate. The HOA was claiming that anonymous reports had raised concerns about the ramp's design and that it posed a hazard to the community. The letter was signed by Lorinda and 2 other board members, but the wording had shifted. Now it referenced danger to others, implying liability to the neighborhood itself, not just Odessa. It was the beginning of a coordinated strategy. They weren't just trying to fine me anymore. They were setting up a justification to remove the ramp entirely. I didn't wait. I drove straight to the building permit office downtown, pulled the ramp's approval file, and confirmed again that everything had been done above board. Diagrams, materials, slope ratio, safety rails, all signed off by the city 2 years ago. On the way home, I stopped at the physical therapy center my mom would be transferred to. I needed to understand what her recovery would look like, how much support she'd need, what kind of mobility assistance they'd recommend, and how soon she'd be expected to bear weight again. The answer was sobering: 8 to 10 weeks minimum. The therapist showed me the standard progression for post-surgical geriatric patients. Then she asked if the house had stairs. "It used to," I said, "but I built a ramp." Her eyes softened. "Then you already gave her a head start." That stuck with me. The HOA wasn't just attacking me now. They were attacking her recovery, her ability to return home, her right to live independently. I drove back to Larchwood Glen with the trauma report sitting on the passenger seat like a loaded weapon. Not flashy, just quiet, conclusive power. But I still needed one more piece: Merritt. I found him trimming hedges in front of his garage, hands moving slower than usual, eyes locked downward. I didn't stop the car. I rolled down the window and said one sentence: "The trauma report confirms it." He didn't respond. I added, "External lateral force, unlikely from a slip." Still nothing, but his shoulders tensed. Then I parked, stepped out, and walked up beside him without speaking. He kept his eyes on the clippers, slicing tiny sprigs that didn't need trimming. "She trusted you," I said. "Calla did, and so did Odessa." His hands finally stopped, the clippers lowered. "I didn't mean for her to fall," he murmured. "I didn't think she'd actually do it." I didn't say anything. I thought she'd yell, maybe argue, not... He couldn't finish the sentence. Then he turned slowly toward me. His face was pale, and I saw something new in his eyes, shame that had nowhere left to hide. "I'll write it down," he said. "I'll sign it." And just like that, the crack became a fracture. Lorinda had her patterns, but I had my evidence, and now I had a witness. The notary's stamp hit the page with a quiet finality. Merritt sat across from me at the kitchen table, hands clenched so tightly around his coffee mug I thought it might crack. The affidavit was just under 2 pages, concise, specific, and impossible to misinterpret. His language had been careful, but the key sentence landed exactly where it needed to. "I witnessed HOA President Lorinda Caskell make physical contact with Odessa Vex Walker, resulting in her fall." He didn't look up after the notary left. "I didn't sleep last night," he said. "First time that's happened in years." "You did the right thing." "Right doesn't feel very safe." "I know." We sat in silence for a while, the same kind of silence that had protected Lorinda for a decade. But now it was shifting. The house felt heavier, like the air itself knew what was coming. I walked him to the door and thanked him again. He didn't ask what I planned to do next. Maybe he didn't want to know, or maybe he already did. I didn't wait another hour. By mid-morning, I had submitted everything: Merritt's signed statement, the trauma report, a detailed timeline of the tampered camera feed, the fabricated citations, and copies of the HOA's landscaping schedule to the Elder Protection Division via secure upload. I knew their review process could take weeks, maybe longer, but evidence like this didn't sit ignored. Once it entered the system, it couldn't be buried. Next was the HOA's insurer. I tracked down the underwriter's contact through public liability filings and left a message noting that an active injury claim involving HOA misconduct was being prepared, including a physician's analysis and corroborating witness testimony. I kept it professional, clean, precise, every word chosen for maximum weight. The response came faster than I expected. A voicemail from a woman named Claire Stanford, risk assessor for the insurer's liability division. She asked for a full packet of documentation and confirmed that the HOA's policy would be reviewed for potential suspension pending investigation. Her voice was calm, but not casual. She'd heard enough in my message to know this wasn't about weeds on a lawn or fence colors. This was litigation territory, and Lorinda would feel that before week's end. That afternoon, I returned to Odessa's hospital room with a printed copy of the affidavit. She was groggy but alert, her hands trembling slightly from the medication. I placed the document in her lap, and her eyes scanned the lines slowly. She didn't cry, she just nodded once and whispered, "I knew she pushed me. I know." She looked straight at me, like I didn't belong there. "You do, and you're going to come home soon." Her lips pressed together, and I could see her fighting the urge to say something heavy, but she didn't. She just reached for my hand and squeezed it with what little strength she had. I sat with her for another hour, talking about nothing in particular, the flowers in the window, a dog we'd seen on a walk 2 months ago, the way the neighborhood smelled in the mornings before anyone woke up. It was the kind of conversation people have when they're holding something deeper inside, something they're trying not to break open. When I left, I took the affidavit back with me. The next step wasn't court, not yet. It was the board meeting. Every second Thursday, Larchwood Glen's HOA held its public session. Normally, just a half dozen residents showed up. But this time, I was going to change that. I spent the evening printing flyers, simple ones. HOA board meeting, Thursday, 7 p.m., clubhouse. You deserve to know what's happening. I didn't need to explain. The buzz had already started. Neighbors had seen the ambulance, seen the orange sticker, seen Lorinda's smug silence. People knew something was wrong. They just needed a reason to show up. And now, they had one. I taped the flyers on mailboxes, dog stations, and community boards. I slid them into newspaper boxes and under doormats. By the time the sun set, half the neighborhood had been quietly invited. I knew Lorinda would notice, that she'd try to stop it. But it was already in motion. This wasn't just about fines anymore. It was about harm. And I was done letting her define the story. Thursday arrived heavy, with humidity, the kind that pressed into your lungs like a warning. By 6:45, the clubhouse parking lot was full, more full than I'd ever seen it. People were standing on the grass, lingering near hedges, even leaning on cars with folded arms. Not talking much, but watching, waiting. Inside, the boardroom felt tighter than usual. The folding chairs squeaked as people took their places. Some held flyers. Others clutched copies of their own HOA citations. No one spoke above a murmur. Lorinda sat at the head of the table like always, flanked by Gerald Linver on her right and Carla Dims on her left. Her hair was perfect, her blouse stiff, her expression unreadable. She tapped the gavel once, too hard, like she needed to remind everyone whose room this was. "Meeting will now come to order," she said, scanning the faces like they'd wandered into a courtroom she owned. Then Merritt walked in. He didn't say a word, just closed the door gently behind him, adjusted his tie, and made his way to the end of the board table with a stack of documents under his arm. Lorinda saw him. Her jaw stiffened just enough to register. "Mr. Halden," she said, "we weren't expecting your attendance tonight." "I'm a board member," he replied, louder than usual. "Attendance is expected." The air shifted. Someone near the front actually nodded. Lorinda didn't respond, just moved on like nothing had happened. Agenda items, budget line adjustments, seasonal flower planting, dog waste stations. She moved through them like script, rushing to get to the part where she could control the floor again. And then she opened the room for comments. The first few speakers were careful. Questions about pool hours, clarification on shrub height policies. But the tension was building. Then a woman from Arbor Lane stood up and said, "How many ramps have been denied this year?" Lorinda blinked. "I'm not sure I understand the question. I asked how many accessibility ramps the HOA has denied. That depends on architectural consistency, material type, and it's a yes or no. How many denials?" Lorinda shifted in her seat. That's when I stood up. "My mother is still in the hospital." Every head turned. She was injured on a ramp this board tried to remove, a ramp that passed city inspection, a ramp that Lorinda Caskell personally tried to sabotage, verbally, procedurally, and physically. Lorinda slammed the gavel down. "You are out of order, Mr. Veck." I didn't move. "No, ma'am, you are." Someone near the back let out a quiet, "Damn." "I've submitted a report to the state's Elder Protection Division," I continued, including a signed affidavit from a board member. I've also contacted the HOA's insurer regarding coordinated negligence and potential fraud. Lorinda's mouth parted, but no sound came. Then Merritt stood. He opened the folder in his hand, pulled out a copy of the affidavit, and placed it face up on the table. I saw her push Odessa Vex Walker, he said. I watched Odessa fall. The room froze. Lorinda's voice dropped to a hiss. You don't know what you're doing. I know exactly what I'm doing, Merritt said. The moment stretched too long. Even Gerald shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly aware that the tide had turned. I looked around the room. How many of you have been cited unfairly? Had requests denied for reasons that don't exist in the bylaws? Hands went up. Dozens. Not timidly, openly. Lorinda tried to speak, but this time her voice had no weight. And then Carla Dims, the board secretary, reached into her folder and pulled something out. A folded sheet of HOA letterhead. She slid it forward. My resignation, she said. Effective immediately. Gerald followed a beat later. The board was unraveling in real time. Lorinda gripped the gavel so tightly her knuckles turned white. This meeting is adjourned. No, Merritt said softly. It's only just beginning. She stood, eyes sweeping the room like it had betrayed her. But no one moved to stop her. No one backed her. She turned and walked out the side door into the night. The room stayed quiet. Then someone clapped. One clap, then a second, then the whole room filled with it. But I didn't hear applause. I heard something louder. Silence. Breaking. The fallout began before sunrise. By 8 a.m., a group of residents had already gathered at the mailbox cluster near the front gate, speaking in hushed but purposeful tones. Someone had printed copies of Merritt's affidavit and was passing them out like flyers. Others whispered about Carla's resignation and how Gerald had stormed out without a word after the meeting. The HOA message board online, usually dead quiet, was flooded with screenshots, photos, and a post titled, "What Happens Now?" I didn't reply, not yet. Because while the neighborhood buzzed with vindication, I knew the real battle was just beginning. Lorinda might have lost the room, but she still held the HOA's procedural machinery. The board was wounded, but not dissolved. The bylaws were still in effect. And most importantly, the insurance hadn't officially acted. Yet. But I had momentum. And I knew how to use it. I spent the next 4 hours assembling a legal binder so airtight it could survive a monsoon. Page 1, Odessa's trauma report. Page 2, the affidavit. Page 3, the HOA's fabricated citation for Section 4.3c, which didn't exist. Page 4, time-stamped photos of Gerald Linver placing an orange sticker on a medical ramp without proper authorization. Page 5, a snapshot of the landscape crew's work order and the exact timestamp where my security cam feed cut out during their visit. The last section, screenshots of the neighborhood message board showing public concern, systemic harassment, and clear evidence of selective enforcement. Then, I printed 10 copies. Next stop was the city clerk's office, where I filed an official complaint under the state's Protective Measures for Vulnerable Adults in Residential Communities Act. Most people didn't even know that statute existed, but I did. It required any governing body that received state certification or funding to respond within 10 business days to an elder abuse allegation. Lorinda hadn't seen it coming. That was the point. While I waited for the forms to process, I sat in the corner of the office and pulled out my laptop. I drafted a formal letter to Claire Stanford at the HOA's insurance provider, notifying her that the neighborhood now had public acknowledgement of board misconduct, as well as a mass resignation. I attached the full binder as a single PDF and titled the file, Incident Package, Larchwood Glen, Active Harm Report. I didn't need to make threats. The documents spoke for themselves. At noon, my phone buzzed. Claire. I stepped outside to take the call, heart thudding low in my throat. "We've received your file," she said. "It's extensive. I only included verifiable materials." She was quiet a beat. "We've opened an internal review of the HOA's liability status. Their current coverage is contingent upon ethical governance and procedural compliance. This kind of documentation voids that, I assume." In many cases, yes. Our legal department will reach out to the board directly. I would recommend the community prepare for temporary administrative oversight. Meaning, meaning if the board can't reconstitute itself within state standards, a receiver may be appointed. I let the silence stretch, then she added, "And Mr. Vec?" The trauma report was very clear. Yes, it was. Tell your mother we're wishing her a full recovery. I ended the call with a steady hand, but my chest was rattling. It was working. Lorinda might have slammed the door last night, but the system was creaking open now, not because it wanted to, but because I gave it no choice. Later that afternoon, I walked Odessa's ramp again, pausing at the spot where the walker had caught the edge before tipping. The grain was still scratched, the wood still slightly stained. I didn't clean it, not yet. That mark had become part of the timeline, part of the evidence. And until this was over, I wanted to see it every day. As I turned to go back inside, I saw Merritt approaching from across the street. He looked tired, but upright. "City notice came through," he said. "They're sending a state mediator next week." "That fast? Guess your binder worked." He handed me a folded paper. "And the neighborhood's calling for a special election, emergency clause. Enough signatures already filed." I unfolded it. 47 names. "That's half the community," I said. "More than enough." He didn't smile, but he didn't look away either. "You're going to be asked to run," he added. "I'm not interested in power," I said. "Good," he replied. "That's exactly why you should." The next 3 days moved like falling dominoes, slow at first, then fast enough to knock breath from your lungs. It started with the notice of coverage suspension. The HOA's insurer sent a formal letter to all board members, current and former, stating that their liability coverage was provisionally suspended pending internal investigation into governance misconduct and failure to uphold safety standards. The language was polite, but the consequences were clear. Without coverage, the HOA couldn't make decisions involving property access, rule enforcement, or structural alterations, meaning they were paralyzed. Next came the state-mandated administrative freeze. The city clerk's office acknowledged my complaint under the Elder Protection Statute and issued a temporary freeze on HOA enforcement actions until a formal review hearing. That meant no new fines, no procedural votes, no sticker slapping on medically approved ramps, and Lorinda, gone. She hadn't been seen since the board meeting. Her car hadn't moved from the driveway. No new postings appeared under her account on the HOA portal. I didn't believe she was finished. People like Lorinda don't surrender. They vanish until they can control the room again. But she'd underestimated how loud silence can become when truth starts echoing through it. On Saturday morning, I stood under the sycamore tree at the corner of Delmont Drive and Alder Crescent, clipboard in hand, passing out election flyers. Emergency Board Election. Protect your voice. Monday, 6 p.m. The air was warm, breezeless, and tense. Not angry, not hopeful, just waiting. People walked by and nodded, took flyers, asked questions. No one shouted, no one laughed. They were ready, but wary. Years of procedural fear don't dissolve overnight. You have to show people the boardroom door is open before they believe they can walk through it. I knew that better than anyone. That afternoon, I finalized the neighborhood presentation. It wasn't flashy, just a 3-ring binder organized with tabs, matching the same file I'd given the city and the insurer. But I added one thing: Odessa's photo. A single image of her before the fall, standing at the top of the ramp with her hand on the rail and a smile that made the porch look like home. I slipped it into a clear front pocket on the binder, not for sympathy, for memory, because too many people in this place had forgotten what community was supposed to mean. That night, I met with a small group of residents in our neighbor Dina's garage. Folding chairs, plastic cups, uneven concrete floor. They asked me what came next, what would change, what needed to be rebuilt. I told them I wasn't interested in control, but I was very interested in protections. I outlined a new ramp access policy based on ADA guidelines. Proposed a compliance review board made of rotating residents, not just board members. Suggested HOA meetings be recorded and archived publicly. And perhaps most importantly, I told them no one should be fined or punished without access to a neutral ombudsperson. I expected pushback. Instead, I got pen taps against notepads and quiet nods. It wasn't applause, but it was alignment. The next morning, I went back to the ramp. The sticker Gerald had placed was long gone, but the mark it left on the wood was still faintly visible. a rectangle of sticky residue that wouldn't quite peel off, like a wound still scabbing over. I didn't scrub it. Instead, I installed a small brass plate just above it. 4 screws, one word engraved, Odessa's Way. It wasn't about branding the ramp. It was about reclaiming it. That ramp had been the weapon Lorinda tried to turn against us, a symbol of shame, of resistance, of weakness. Now it was something else. It was a line in the dirt. By noon, the mediator arrived from the city, a woman in her 60s with no-nonsense shoes and a clipboard of her own. She didn't smile, she didn't chat. She simply walked the neighborhood, took notes, and made it clear the election would proceed with full state oversight. Accountability had arrived, and this time, no gavel could stop it. The air inside the clubhouse buzzed with an unfamiliar energy. Anticipation, not fear. Folding chairs had been set up in tight rows, more than usual, and almost everyone was filled. Some residents stood along the walls. A few even brought small stools from home. At the front, under the old cork bulletin board, the city-appointed mediator sat at a plain table with a small recorder, 2 pens, and a neutral expression. This wasn't a normal HOA meeting. This was a reckoning. At exactly 6 o'clock, the mediator stood and opened the session. My name is Nadine Kerrigan. I'm here as a neutral party appointed by the Office of Residential Affairs. Tonight's meeting concerns emergency reconstitution of the Larchwood Glen HOA Board in accordance with the Municipal Code 9-13B, following mass resignation, external complaint filings, and suspension of insurance coverage. We will begin with a review of recent filings and statements. She didn't say Lorinda's name. She didn't have to. I sat near the back, binder in my lap, waiting. I wasn't the one running. I wasn't the one begging to keep control. I was here to close the loop. Nadine reviewed the timeline, calmly and without inflection. The trauma report, the witness affidavit, the city complaint, the insurer's provisional suspension, and the forced emergency election under Larchwood's own bylaws. She paused only once, when she reached the part about Odessa's injuries. Then she looked up. We will now hear from any residents wishing to provide public statements. The room hesitated. Then Dina stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shake. She simply spoke into the microphone and told them about the time Lorinda denied her request to move her mailbox 4 inches closer to the curb after back surgery, about how she'd paid 3 fines before giving up, about how the same day she'd given up, Lorinda approved a pergola 3 houses down for aesthetic reasons. One by one, others followed. A father with a disabled daughter. An elderly woman fined for a walker ramp too steep, even though the city approved it. A couple that had been asked to trim their tree 3 times in 1 month for shading the walking path, even though the tree had stood there for decades. By the time Merritt stood, the room was already raw. I watched her fall, he said, hands trembling. I watched Lorinda push the walker, and I didn't speak up. Not because I didn't care, but because I was afraid. He looked around. No one should have to choose between protecting their family and doing what's right, but I did, and I'll carry that. He stepped down. No applause, just silence, heavy and full. Nadine nodded, then turned her eyes toward me. Mr. Vec? I stood slowly and walked to the front. My hands didn't shake. I opened the binder, flipped to the front image, Odessa smiling at the top of the ramp, and held it facing out. This is my mother, I said. Her name is Odessa Vec. The ramp she's standing on is medically necessary, structurally sound, and city approved. It's also the reason she was targeted, harassed, and ultimately injured by this HOA. No one blinked. I submitted the trauma report. I submitted the affidavit. I submitted the insurance violations and the procedural abuse. But what I want to submit now is this. This ramp is still here. She's still in recovery, and she will come home. And when she does, she won't be coming home under the shadow of that board. I returned to my seat. Nadine took a breath. Based on the filings, testimonies, and confirmed documentation, this board is formally dissolved as of this evening. A provisional committee will be selected tonight to oversee the community until elections are held under new compliance standards. People whispered, but no one cheered. This wasn't the kind of win you clap for. It was the kind you hold in your chest and feel beating for hours after. Then, Nadine added, almost as an afterthought, the prior president, Ms. Lorinda Caskell, was formally served notice this morning by the Office of Consumer Enforcement. A civil hearing is scheduled. A permanent bar from HOA governance is under review. A breath released across the room like a valve had opened, and just like that, the weight shifted. The gavel didn't fall that night. It wasn't needed. The silence said everything. By the next morning, the neighborhood had changed, not in the way you'd notice from a passing car. The houses still stood the same, the hedges still trimmed into careful shapes, the seasonal wreaths still hung on identical, beige doors. But the way people walked changed. No more quick glances over shoulders when stepping outside. No more tight-lipped nods as if afraid to be seen saying hello. It was subtle, but it was real, like someone had lifted an invisible pressure from the air. Odessa came home that afternoon. She was thinner, bruised, moving slower than she used to, but her eyes were sharp as ever. She sat in her wheelchair at the top of the ramp, looking down at the length of the wood like she didn't trust it anymore. "It's the same ramp," I told her. "No," she said quietly. "It's not." She wasn't wrong. Something had shifted in it too. Maybe it was just how it carried memory now, like it knew what had happened on it, like it had been witness. I wheeled her down slowly, every creak familiar. She looked at the brass plate near the bottom rail, the one I'd installed without telling her. Her fingers brushed the edge where her blood had once dried. "Odessa's Way," she whispered, a sad smile forming. "You named it?" "No," I said. "It named itself." She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she nodded once and whispered, "Good." Neighbors stopped by in waves that evening, some with flowers, others with casseroles, but most with just words, soft apologies, quiet thank yous. They stood at the foot of the ramp like it was a memorial, and for a while, it was. Not to suffering, but to the boundary that had been crossed, and the one we'd all agreed to redraw. Merritt came by just after sunset. He stood on the porch like he wasn't sure if he should knock. Odessa saw him through the window and said, "Let him in." He stepped into the living room with a humility that made him look smaller than he really was. He held a folder in one hand and a folded piece of paper in the other. "I wanted to give you this," he said to her, offering the paper first. "It's the official acknowledgement from the state. They accepted my statement as credible. The hearing for Lorinda's case has been added to the civil calendar." Odessa took it gently, then passed it to me. "And this," he said, holding out the folder to me, "is a copy of the petition. We're proposing a formal vote to reclassify accessibility structures as permanent exemptions, not optional modifications. The interim board agreed to sponsor it. It needs to pass by 2/3. I opened it. 64 signatures. That was more than we'd ever had for anything in Larchwood Glen. "You'll pass it?" I said. He nodded. "Because of her." He looked toward Odessa again, eyes filled with something like respect and guilt. "I should have done something sooner," he said quietly. Odessa didn't scold him. She didn't let him off the hook either. "You did it when it counted," she replied. "Just make sure you don't wait next time." He swallowed hard and nodded. The door closed behind him with a softness that felt earned. Later that night, I stood alone at the bottom of the ramp. Streetlights buzzed quietly overhead, moths circling in slow spirals. I traced my hand along the railing, remembering every hour it took to build it, every screw driven by hand, every board measured 3 times. It had been just a ramp before, a simple thing, but now it was a line, not just between home and sidewalk, but between what people are willing to accept and what they finally refuse to allow. Lorinda had made the mistake of thinking the community was hers to control, but all it took was one push too far. And we'd remembered who it really belonged to. The sky broke open in gold that morning, light spilling across the street like something had been reset. Odessa was sitting at the window, her cup of tea steaming against the glass, watching the neighborhood she'd refused to leave. The ramp glowed under the sun, clean now, restored, the brass plate catching the light just enough to throw a shimmer across the porch. A week had passed since the hearing. Lorinda's name was gone from every HOA record, her login credentials revoked, her titles struck through in official documents. The city had ruled in our favor: elder abuse, negligence, liability. The HOA's insurer pulled coverage entirely. Without it, the board couldn't function. The receiver had already begun rewriting the bylaws from the ground up. Larchwood Glen was starting over, but it wasn't victory that settled in my chest that morning. It was silence. Real silence. Not the kind that comes from fear, but the kind that comes after a storm finally runs out of thunder. I stepped outside and ran my hand along the ramp rail, tracing the grain I'd memorized. The wood was warm under my fingers. Every line, every groove, still held the weight of what had happened. I could almost hear my father's voice, the same one that used to echo through our garage when he taught me how to level beams. Structure tells truth, Dorian. It always does. You can't hide force. You can only deny it until it breaks. He'd been right. Across the street, Merritt was planting new shrubs near the curb, his movements slow but steady. He looked up, caught my eye, and gave a quiet nod. Not the kind you give to a neighbor. The kind you give to someone who's been through the same fire. The whole neighborhood was different now. You could see it in how people spoke to one another. No more tiptoeing around authority. No more waiting for permission to live. 2 houses down, Carla Dims was setting up a ramp of her own. Her husband had been struggling with his knees for years, but refused to install one out of pride and fear of fines. Now, she was out there with a measuring tape and a confident grin. If anyone wants to fine me, she'd said the night before, they can take it up with Odessa's Way. That phrase had spread faster than I ever expected. Odessa's Way wasn't just a name anymore. It had become shorthand for fairness, for resistance, for boundaries that couldn't be rewritten by a clipboard. When Odessa wheeled herself out onto the porch, she didn't look fragile anymore. She looked rooted. She touched the top rail and smiled faintly. "He would have liked this," she said. "Dad?" "Yes. The way you turned what broke us into something that holds us up." I knelt beside her. "He taught us both the same thing. Never build something that only stands until someone leans on it." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She just looked out across the street, where the new committee had begun meeting under the trees instead of in the clubhouse. No titles, no power games, just neighbors. The ramp creaked slightly as I adjusted the bottom screw of the plate. A faint breeze carried the smell of cedar and grass. Somewhere, a lawnmower started, then stopped again. Ordinary sounds, beautiful ordinary sounds. That's when I realized the story wasn't about Lorinda anymore. It never really had been. It was about every quiet resident she'd stepped over, every rule she'd twisted to fit her reflection, every voice that had stayed silent until one moment broke it open. Mom reached down and squeezed my shoulder. "You didn't just fix a ramp," she said. "You fixed a place." I smiled. We all did. The brass plate gleamed brighter now, catching sunlight at the perfect angle. I watched as a neighbor's kid rode his bike up the edge of the sidewalk, slowed and stopped just to read the engraving. He mouthed the words, "Odessa's Way," like it was a street sign that had always been there. It struck me then how easily legacy can hide in something ordinary. A plank of wood, a name carved in metal, a promise rebuilt with quiet hands. It's not the noise that keeps a community standing. It's the truth no one can erase once it's carved deep enough. If you're watching this, remember, sometimes justice doesn't come from titles or power or revenge. It comes from refusing to let cruelty stand unmeasured. It comes from building something that lasts. Where are you watching from tonight? And if it were your home, your family, your ramp, would you have fought back?